The night I signed my name away, it was raining so hard I could barely see the front steps of the house. I remember that detail because later, when people asked me why I did it, they expected some dramatic explanation. Love, sacrifice, blind trust. The truth was quieter than that. It was rain tapping against glass, my husband's voice steady and patient, and the sense that saying no would make me the difficult one. I was 32 years old then. I had built a company from my kitchen table and a borrowed laptop, grown it through missed vacations and dinners eaten cold. By the time it was profitable enough to attract real attention, I was already tired in a way youth does not prepare you for. I wanted briefly to rest. That was when my husband suggested I step back. Not leave, not disappear, just step back. You've earned it, he said, sliding the folder across the dining table. 2 years, stay home, take care of yourself. Let us handle the stress. Us meant him and his parents. They had opinions about everything, but they framed them as concern. His mother spoke softly, like every sentence was a favor. His father talked numbers and legacy, family business, stability, words that sound warm until they close around your wrists. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself marriage meant trust, and trust sometimes meant letting go of control. The document was clean, legal, boring. My name appeared where it needed to. I signed without ceremony. No champagne, no speeches, just the scrape of pen on paper and the quiet click of a folder closing. That was the moment I stopped being the owner of my life and became a guest inside it. At first, nothing changed. I woke up later, made a coffee instead of rushing to emails. People congratulated me on finally slowing down. My husband kissed my forehead on his way out the door, told me I deserved peace. But peace is not the absence of noise. It is the presence of choice. And slowly my choices began to disappear. It started with small corrections. That's not how we do it anymore, my mother-in-law said when I suggested a marketing angle I had invented. She smiled when she said it, the way people do when they believe they are being kind. My husband stopped asking for my input. He informed me instead. Budget changes, staffing decisions, office relocations. I nodded, told myself I was being mature. At home, expectations crept in. Since I was free, it made sense that I handled errands, managed appointments, adjusted my schedule around theirs. It was never demanded outright, it was implied. An implication is harder to refuse. By the end of the first year, my name had vanished from conversations. People referred to the company as if it had always belonged to them. When I corrected someone once lightly, my husband laughed and said, "You sound possessive." I let it go. Possessive is what people call women when they defend what is theirs. The real shift came the day I realized I needed permission. I wanted to book a flight to visit my sister for Thanksgiving. I mentioned it casually over dinner. My husband paused, fork midair. "Now isn't a great time," he said. "We're restructuring." I reminded him I wasn't involved anymore. "That's exactly why you need to be flexible," his father said. Support from the sidelines. It was a sentence I would hear many times in different forms. From the sidelines. Stay back, don't interfere, be grateful. By the second year, the house no longer felt like mine. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Decisions were made elsewhere. My husband grew distant in a way that wasn't anger, but efficiency. Like a manager phasing out an employee. The pressure didn't come in shouting, it came in silence. Days went by where no one asked how I was. Nights where my husband slept facing the wall. When I spoke about feeling isolated, my mother-in-law tilted her head and said, "You're too sensitive. We're all under stress." I started doubting my own reactions, wondering if this was what adulthood looked like, endurance instead of joy. Then my body began to fail. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow unraveling, headaches that lasted for days, a weight in my chest that made breathing feel optional. I stopped sleeping. When I did sleep, I dreamed of rooms without doors. The morning I collapsed, the floor was cold against my cheek. I remember noticing the pattern in the tile, thinking it was strange how clear everything looked as my vision blurred. At the hospital, they called it exhaustion, acute stress response. The doctor asked about my work. "I don't work anymore," I said. My husband answered for me. "She worries too much." I stayed for 3 nights, long enough for IV fluids and quiet, long enough to think. No one from the company visited. My mother-in-law brought soup and told the nurse I had always been dramatic. My husband checked his phone during my discharge instructions. When I came home, nothing changed. No apology, no acknowledgement. just a suggestion that I take medication and stop overthinking. That was when I understood something that would later save me. Their cruelty was not intentional in the way movies depict. It was structural, built into how they saw me. Useful when compliant, invisible when inconvenient. When love I realized had been conditional the entire time. I did not confront them. I did not scream or cry or threaten. I watched. I noted dates, emails, signatures. I requested copies of documents under the guise of curiosity. I reconnected with an old colleague under the excuse of friendship. And quietly, for the first time in 2 years, I made a decision that did not require anyone's approval. It was a small one, almost unnoticeable, but it was the beginning. The rain returned that winter, tapping against the same windows, but I was no longer listening to it as background noise. I was listening for patterns, for timing. Christmas was 11 months away, and by then I would no longer be a guest. People think revenge begins with anger. It doesn't. It begins with clarity. Mine came in the form of a calendar. After the hospital time changed texture, days no longer blurred together. I noticed dates, gaps, patterns. Who called when? Who didn't? Which conversations happened in rooms I wasn't invited into? Which documents were suddenly misplaced when I asked for them? I was still officially the wife, still the daughter-in-law, still the woman who had once founded the company everyone now spoke about as if it were inherited furniture. But functionally, I had been removed. They didn't announce it, they edited me out. I stopped trying to insert myself back in. Instead, I rebuilt routines that belonged only to me. Morning walks, a notebook I kept hidden under the mattress. I wrote down things I remembered, dates of board meetings I used to run. The day my title changed from founder to consultant, then quietly disappeared altogether. Words my husband used when he thought I wasn't listening. You're lucky, be reasonable, don't complicate things. I wrote those down too. The company still bore the fingerprints of my decisions. Vendor relationships I had negotiated, contracts drafted in my voice, systems I had designed when no one believed it would work. I knew where the bones were buried, metaphorically speaking. Not secrets, structures. And structures can be dismantled. I reached out to an attorney under the pretense of updating my will. I chose someone recommended by a woman I trusted, not a family friend. That mattered. In the first meeting, I spoke carefully. I didn't accuse. I described. 2 years ago, I said I transferred operational control to my husband and his parents, temporarily. I'd like to understand what rights I still retain. The attorney didn't interrupt. She took notes. When I finished, she asked one question. Did you give up ownership or management authority? I had assumed those were the same thing. They weren't. For the first time in months, I felt my shoulders lower. Just a fraction. Enough to breathe. We scheduled a follow-up. She asked me to gather documents, incorporation papers, amendments, emails referencing the transition, anything with dates and signatures. I told her I would try. At home, I became invisible on purpose. I listened more than I spoke. When my husband talked about the company, I nodded and asked neutral questions. How's cash flow? Any issues with staffing? He liked explaining things. It made him feel powerful. Powerful people get careless. He left his laptop open one afternoon while he showered. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. A printed folder sat on the desk, my name typed cleanly on the cover. Former agreements. The word former did something sharp inside my chest. I waited until the house was empty. Then I photographed every page. They had restructured without me. Changed bylaws. Created compensation packages. Reassigned intellectual property. All legal if you believed consent had been informed. It hadn't been. But proving that required patience, not rage. Thanksgiving came and went. I sent polite texts, smiled through a dinner where my seat felt decorative. My mother-in-law talked about the company's future as if it were her child. My husband corrected her numbers once. She laughed and said, "You're better at this than she ever was." She nodded toward me, still smiling. I smiled back. Inside, something hardened. That night, my husband told me I should consider finding a hobby, maybe volunteer work. You need something that's yours, he said, unaware of the irony. I already had something. Information. In December, I received a call from a former employee. She apologized for reaching out, said she'd heard I wasn't involved anymore, asked if I knew why her severance had been delayed. I told her I didn't, Then I asked if she'd received anything in writing. She had. She forwarded the email. It bore my old digital signature. I forwarded it to my attorney. That was the moment the situation crossed from personal betrayal into legal exposure. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just real. I was being used as a shield. My attorney didn't raise her voice when she called me back. She didn't need to. She explained calmly what misrepresentation meant, how liability works, how silence can be interpreted as consent. She asked if I wanted to proceed carefully or aggressively. I chose carefully. Christmas decorations appeared in the house like nothing was wrong. A tree I hadn't chosen. Ornaments placed where I wouldn't have put them. My mother-in-law insisted on hosting this year, said it would be symbolic. Of what she didn't say, I said yes. Not because I wanted to celebrate, because timing matters. In the weeks leading up to it, I signed nothing. I spoke little. I gathered more than they realized. I learned that the company had applied for a line of credit using its original founding structure. My structure. They needed my name. They just hadn't told me yet. The night before Christmas Eve, my husband sat beside me on the couch and told me there were some papers I'd need to sign. Just routine, just formalities, just. I asked to see them. He said tomorrow would be fine. Tomorrow, I thought, is exactly when everything changes. I went to bed early. Not because I was tired, but because I needed to be alone with my thoughts. With the version of myself that had signed that first document in the rain. I wasn't angry with her anymore. She had done what she thought love required. I was done doing that. Downstairs I heard laughter, glasses clinking, my name mentioned casually like an accessory. I closed my eyes and pictured the calendar again. Christmas was no longer a holiday. It was a deadline. Christmas Eve arrived without ceremony. The house filled early. Coats piled on the bench I used to sit on while answering emails. Voices overlapped, familiar and strangely distant. I moved through it all like a piece of furniture that had always been there and no longer needed explanation. No one asked how I was feeling. That was no longer part of the ritual. My mother-in-law directed the kitchen with the authority of someone who believed the space had always belonged to her. My father-in-law held court in the living room, recounting company milestones as if he had been present for their creation. My husband floated between rooms, efficient, relaxed, untouched by doubt. I watched him closely, the way he avoided meeting my eyes, the way he checked his watch every few minutes. He was waiting for something. Dinner was loud. Wine flowed. Someone made a joke about how lucky I was not to have to worry about work anymore. I smiled politely and passed the salad. I had learned that silence unsettles people more than protest. When you don't react, they project their own discomfort onto you. After dessert, my husband finally touched my arm. "Can we talk for a minute?" he asked. We stepped into the study. The door closed softly behind us. The room smelled like leather and pine cleaner. A stack of documents waited on the desk. "Nothing dramatic," he said quickly. "Just housekeeping." He slid the papers toward me. I didn't reach for them. "What are they?" I asked. He exhaled, already tired. "Updated authorizations. The bank needs confirmation before year-end. It's procedural." I flipped through the pages slowly, line by line, clause by clause. I had spent nights relearning this language. I knew where to look. This wasn't authorization. It was erasure. They were asking me to retroactively approve decisions I had never been informed about, to confirm roles I no longer held, to accept responsibility without authority. I looked up at him. "I need time," I said. His jaw tightened. "It's just paperwork." "Then it can wait," I replied. For a moment, something like panic crossed his face. It disappeared quickly, replaced by irritation. "You're overthinking this," he said. "You always do." That sentence landed differently now. I saw it for what it was, a dismissal disguised as familiarity. I placed the papers back on the desk. "I'll have my lawyer review them," I said. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. "Your lawyer," he repeated. "Yes." He laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Since when do you have a lawyer?" I met his eyes, since I realized I needed one. The door opened before he could respond. His mother stood there, concern carefully arranged on her face. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Fine," he said too quickly. I excused myself and went upstairs. My heart was steady. My hands did not shake. That surprised me. In the guest room I had claimed as my own months ago, I locked the door and sent a single text to my attorney. They asked me to sign. I refused. "We need to move." Her reply came within minutes. "Good. Do not sign anything. Tomorrow morning we proceed." Downstairs I could hear voices again, louder now, tighter. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly, methodically. I thought about the woman I had been when I signed away control. How eager she had been to believe that love meant protection. Love I understood now had been used as leverage. I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that comes when your body finally believes you are no longer in danger. Christmas morning was cold and bright. The house smelled like coffee and cinnamon. I came downstairs dressed carefully neutrally, no holiday cheer, no defiance, just presents. Gifts were exchanged. I received a scarf I didn't need. I thanked them sincerely. They watched me closely as if expecting something else. After breakfast, my father-in-law cleared his throat. "We should talk about next year," he said, folding his hands. "Strategic planning." My husband nodded. "There are some decisions to finalize." I sat down across from them. "Before that," I said, "there's something I need to clarify." They waited. "I've retained independent legal counsel," I continued. "All future communication regarding the company will go through her." The reaction was not explosive, it was worse. My mother-in-law looked wounded. "Why would you do that?" she asked softly. "We're family." That's exactly why I replied. My husband's face darkened. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be." "No," I said. "I'm finally seeing it at the right size." They spoke over one another then. Concern, confusion, disappointment, the familiar chorus. I let it wash over me. When there was a pause, I stood. "I'm going out," I said. "I'll be back later." I didn't wait for permission. At a small cafe across town, I met my attorney in person for the first time since everything had begun to surface. She was calm, efficient. She had already prepared documents. "They've overreached," she said, sliding a folder toward me, more than once. She outlined the next steps. Formal notices, injunctions, requests for records, a timeline that would make their holiday credit line impossible without my cooperation. "You understand this will escalate," she said. "Yes," I answered. She studied me for a moment. "You're not angry?" "No," I said. "I'm finished." When I returned to the house that evening, the mood had shifted. Polite, guarded. My husband barely spoke to me. I packed a small bag and told them I'd be staying elsewhere for a few days. "Don't be dramatic," my mother-in-law said. I kissed her cheek lightly. "I'm not." As I closed the door behind me, I felt something unfamiliar. Relief. I drove away, knowing this was no longer about revenge in the way people imagine it. There would be no shouting, no public humiliation. What was coming would be quieter, legal, permanent. And they still had no idea how much of their future depended on a woman they had already written off. I didn't go far. I checked into a small hotel on the edge of town, the kind with neutral art and reliable silence. I chose it because no one I knew would think to look there. Familiarity had become a liability. That first night alone, I didn't cry. I unpacked methodically, placed my toothbrush in a glass, set my phone on the nightstand screen down. I needed the physical reminder that I was allowed to take up space without explaining why. In the morning, my attorney called early. "They're already reacting," she said. "Your husband contacted their corporate counsel. They're asking for a meeting." "Through you," I said. "Of course." She paused. "Before we proceed, I need to ask you something. Are you prepared for what you might learn?" Yes, I was. The illusion that there was something left to protect had dissolved the moment they asked me to sign away responsibility without authority. Whatever truth remained was no longer dangerous. It was simply information. The first formal notice went out that afternoon. A request for records, financial statements, board minutes, copies of all documents bearing my name in the last 2 years. My husband texted me within minutes. "This is unnecessary. We can talk like adults." I didn't respond. His mother followed an hour later. "I don't understand why you're doing this to us." I turned my phone off. That evening, I took a walk through a nearby park. Children were riding bikes. A couple argued quietly on a bench. Ordinary life unbothered by the slow collapse of my marriage and the careful unspooling of a family business. It struck me then how insulated my crisis was. How many women had walked this same path quietly believing it was their private failure. Back in the hotel room, I opened my notebook and began a new list. Things I would not explain anymore. Why I needed time. Why I needed boundaries. Why I was no longer available to absorb other people's discomfort. The next day, the first documents arrived. Incomplete, selective, carefully curated. My attorney noticed immediately. "They're omitting several board meetings," she said, "and there are discrepancies in compensation reporting." "Meaning?" I asked. "Meaning they assumed you'd never look." We scheduled depositions. That was when the tone changed. My husband showed up unannounced at the hotel that evening. I watched him from the hallway mirror before opening the door. He looked smaller somehow, less certain. "This has gone too far," he said without greeting. "My parents are furious." I stepped aside and let him in. Not because he deserved access, but because I wanted to hear what he would say next. "They think you're trying to punish us," he continued. "Overreacting because you felt left out." I leaned against the desk. "Do you?" He hesitated. "I think you're being influenced," he said finally, "by people who don't understand our family." "Our family?" I repeated. "Yes." I nodded slowly. "When did that stop including me?" He sighed, frustrated. "You're twisting things." "No," I said. "I'm untwisting them." I asked him a single question then, one I had rehearsed but hoped I wouldn't need to ask. "Did you ever intend to give it back?" He didn't answer right away. In that pause, I received everything I needed. "You were happier without the pressure," he said eventually. "We thought it was better this way." Better for whom was implied. I walked to the door and opened it. "You should go," I said. "This doesn't have to end like this," he said. "It already has," I replied. When he left, I locked the door and slid down against it, not in grief, but in release. The waiting was over. The hoping. From then on, everything moved quickly. Subpoenas were issued. Bank records surfaced. The line of credit they had applied for was frozen pending clarification of ownership. A lender requested my direct confirmation. I declined. Not out of spite, out of accuracy. My mother-in-law called my sister. My father-in-law called my former mentor. People began reaching out cautiously as if testing whether I was still the person they remembered or someone else entirely. I was both. The first deposition was scheduled for early January. My husband sat across from me in a conference room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee. He wouldn't look at me. When asked about the transfer of authority, he described it as mutual, voluntary, in my best interest. When my attorney asked whether I had been informed of subsequent changes, he faltered. "I assumed," he said. "Assumption, I learned, is not a defense." By the end of the day, his confidence was gone. Not destroyed, just cracked. That night, I returned to the hotel and ordered room service. Ate slowly. Intentionally. I was reclaiming ordinary things. Christmas decorations were being taken down across the city. Trees abandoned on sidewalks. Lights going dark. I felt no nostalgia. What I felt was momentum. Revenge. I understood now wasn't about making them suffer. It was about restoring balance, about refusing to carry consequences that belonged to someone else. The next phase would be public, not in the tabloids, in filings, in courtrooms, in records that don't care about feelings. They had believed I would remain quiet. They had mistaken silence for weakness. I closed my notebook and wrote one final line for the day. They taught me how to disappear. I taught myself how to return. And this time I wasn't asking for space. I was taking it. By mid-January, my absence had become impossible to ignore. The company's rhythm faltered in ways only I seemed to recognize at first. Vendor calls went unanswered. Decisions stalled. The kind of quiet dysfunction that doesn't make headlines but slowly suffocates everything beneath it. I watched it happen from a distance. My attorney forwarded updates daily, some procedural, some telling. A supplier threatening to revise terms, a senior manager requesting clarification on authority, the lender pushing for resolution before releasing funds. None of it could move forward without me. That was the part they had underestimated. Not my anger, my position. I received an email from the board requesting a private conversation. The tone was suddenly respectful, almost deferential. I agreed on one condition: my attorney would be present. The meeting took place in a neutral office downtown. Glass walls, long table, bottled water no one touched. My husband and his parents sat on one side. 3 board members sat between us physically and metaphorically. For the first time in years, I spoke without being interrupted. I explained calmly how decisions had been made without my consent, how my name had been used without my knowledge, how I had been excluded from meetings where my ownership interest remained relevant. I did not accuse, I documented. My mother-in-law dabbed her eyes with a tissue. "We thought we were helping," she said. "I believe you," I replied. "That doesn't change the outcome." One board member cleared his throat. "We need to resolve this quickly. The company can't operate under uncertainty." "Then restore transparency," I said. They exchanged looks. My husband leaned forward. "What do you want?" It was the first time he had asked that question in 2 years. "I want my role acknowledged," I said. "In writing. I want access to all records. And I want the authority that matches the responsibility you've been assigning me." Silence followed. My father-in-law spoke then, his voice tight. "You're asking for too much." No, I said, I'm asking for what was already mine. The meeting ended without resolution, but something had shifted. The board members looked unsettled. They had expected emotion. They had received clarity. 2 days later, a former executive reached out. She had left quietly months earlier, said she'd been uncomfortable with how things were being handled, offered to provide testimony if needed. I thanked her and forwarded the message to my attorney. Patterns were emerging, not malicious necessarily, but reckless. And recklessness leaves trails. At home, my husband moved into the guest room. We communicated through short texts about logistics, utilities, mail, nothing else. I didn't miss him in the way people expect. I missed the version of myself I had been before I learned how easily trust could be repurposed. One afternoon, I received a call from the hospital billing department. A charge had been submitted under the company's insurance plan authorized by someone else. They had billed my collapse as a work-related incident. My attorney was livid. "This is serious," she said. "They're using your medical crisis to justify coverage decisions without consent." I felt something then, not anger, recognition. They had never seen me as separate from the company, only as a resource, a liability, a line item. The irony was sharp. We added it to the file. By the end of the month, the lender issued a formal notice. Without my signature, the credit line would be withdrawn. Payroll was at risk. The board called another meeting. This time my husband didn't speak much. His parents looked tired, older. I arrived composed, not triumphant, just prepared. "I'm willing to cooperate," I said, "but cooperation requires boundaries." I outlined them clearly. Restoration of my ownership role. A formal separation of personal and corporate authority. Independent oversight. And one more thing. I will no longer be married to the company, I said, or to anyone who benefits from my silence. My husband looked up then. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means I'm filing for separation," I replied. Effective immediately. The room went still. This was not the revenge they had anticipated. There was no dramatic ultimatum. No emotional leverage. Just a decision. After the meeting, my attorney walked with me to the elevator. "You're doing well," she said. "I know," I replied. That night, alone in the hotel room that had begun to feel like a sanctuary, I thought about the word betrayal. How often it's framed as a single act, a moment. For me, it had been a process, slow, incremental, made of reasonable-sounding choices that added up to erasure. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about undoing the past. It was about refusing to let it define the future. Outside, the city moved on. January lights, cold air, people returning to routines. Mine had changed permanently. And for the first time since the rain-soaked night, I signed my name away. I felt something close to control. Not because I was winning, but because I had stopped losing myself to keep the peace. February brought a different kind of cold. Not the kind that bites at your skin, but the kind that settles into rooms where conversations have ended and decisions are being made elsewhere. The company entered what the board politely called a holding pattern. I recognized it for what it was: paralysis. Nothing significant moved forward without my signature. Contracts stalled, hiring froze, the illusion of seamless leadership cracked, and people began asking questions they had avoided before. I stayed quiet, not passive, strategic. My attorney advised me to let the pressure build naturally. "You don't need to push," she said. "They're already leaning." I spent my days organizing records, preparing statements, and meeting with professionals who had no emotional investment in my marriage or my history. Accountants, advisors, a mediator recommended by the court for the separation proceedings. Every meeting reminded me of something I had forgotten: I was competent. Not in theory, in practice. The separation filing landed like a controlled burn. My husband didn't fight it at first. He looked stunned when we met with our respective attorneys, as if the idea that I could leave without collapsing had never occurred to him. "I thought you needed us," he said quietly during a break. "I needed honesty," I replied. I adapted to its absence. That was the last personal conversation we had. The mediator asked predictable questions: assets, timelines, intentions. When the company came up, the temperature in the room shifted. "I built it," I said simply. "Before the marriage, before the shared accounts, before the promises." My husband's attorney argued contribution, support, sacrifice. I listened without reacting. Sacrifice, I had learned, is a word people use when they want credit for something they chose. Midway through the month, an internal audit revealed discrepancies that could no longer be explained away as oversight. Funds redirected without board approval, compensation packages approved retroactively, all technically defensible if no one objected. I objected, not emotionally, formally. The board scheduled an emergency session. This time, my father-in-law did not attend. My mother-in-law joined remotely, her camera angled carefully. One board member spoke plainly. "This is becoming untenable." "It already was," I said. "You're just feeling it now." They asked what resolution I would accept. I had already decided. A formal reinstatement of my ownership and voting rights. A restructuring of leadership that removed familial overlap. And an exit package for my husband that severed his operational control. They stared at me. "That would dismantle the current structure," someone said. "Yes," I replied, "that structure dismantled me." The meeting adjourned without agreement, but the tone had shifted again. Less resistance, more calculation. Outside, snow fell in soft sheets. I watched it through the glass, thinking about how quiet disruption can be. At home, my husband packed his things. I didn't supervise, I didn't hover. When he left, the house felt larger, not emptier, clearer. I changed the locks, not out of spite, out of closure. Late one evening, I received a message from a junior manager I barely knew. She thanked me for standing up, said things had been difficult for a long time, said people were afraid. That message stayed with me. Power doesn't just silence the person it targets, it teaches everyone else to look away. By the end of February, the lender issued a final notice. Without resolution, the credit line would be terminated. The board had days, not weeks. They called me. Not my attorney, me. I let it ring once before answering. "We're prepared to meet your terms," the chair said, "with some adjustments." "Send them in writing," I replied. They did. The document arrived late at night. I read it slowly, carefully. Every clause mattered. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. I signed the next morning. Not in celebration, in acknowledgement. The company was mine again. Not as it had been, changed, scarred, but intact. My husband resigned that afternoon. He sent a short message. No accusations, no apologies, just a statement of fact. I didn't reply. March loomed ahead, heavy with logistics. Court dates, transitions, the work of rebuilding something that had been used against me. People congratulated me, called it a victory. I didn't correct them, but in private I understood the truth. This wasn't about winning. It was about survival. I had been pushed into silence and emerged fluent in my own defense. I had learned that waiting quietly does not mean surrender. Sometimes it means gathering strength where no one thinks to look. The revenge they feared never came. What came instead was accountability, and that I discovered lasts much longer. March didn't arrive with relief. It arrived with work. The first morning I returned to the office as an acknowledged owner, again I didn't announce myself. I parked in the same spot I used to walk through, the same doors, nodded at the same receptionist who looked up in surprise, and then smiled like she'd been waiting for this moment. "Welcome back," she said quietly. That was all. My office had been repurposed. New furniture. Someone else's taste. I didn't comment. I asked for a temporary space and a full access pass. Reclaiming control isn't about theatrics, it's about systems. I spent the first week listening. Department heads, legal, finance. People spoke carefully at first, unsure where loyalty now sat. I didn't ask for allegiance, I asked for facts. What had changed? What was broken? What had been avoided? A pattern emerged. Short-term thinking. Decisions made to keep peace rather than build stability. A culture of deference that rewarded silence and punished initiative. It was familiar. At home, the house echoed differently. I removed the photographs that no longer reflected reality. Not angrily, methodically. Memory doesn't need frames. The separation proceedings moved forward with minimal resistance. My husband's posture shifted from entitlement to resignation. He accepted terms he would have fought months earlier. Power recalibrates quickly when it's no longer guaranteed. One afternoon, my mother-in-law requested a meeting. Not about the company, about family. I agreed to coffee in a public place, neutral ground. She arrived early, sat with her hands folded. When I joined her, she smiled as if nothing irreversible had happened. "I never meant to hurt you," she said. "I know," I replied. She blinked, surprised. "We were just trying to protect what we built," she continued. "I built it," I said gently. "You protected your access to it." She bristled. "That's not fair." "Fairness wasn't part of the process," I said. "Control was." She looked down at her cup. For a moment, I saw something like regret. Or maybe just inconvenience. I miss how things were, she said. So do I answered. But only the parts that were real. We finished our coffee in silence. When we stood to leave, she reached for my arm and then stopped herself. Some bridges don't burn, they erode. Back at the office, I began making changes that didn't make headlines. Updated reporting structures, clear authority lines, a whistleblower policy that didn't exist before. People noticed. A senior manager pulled me aside and said, "It feels different." "It is," I said. I didn't remove everyone associated with the old regime. I didn't need to. I watched who adapted, who resisted, who tried to recreate the same dynamics under new names. Those conversations were brief. The board shifted composition by the end of the month. Independent members replaced family allies. It was framed as modernization. I called it correction. Late one evening, alone in my restored office, I opened the drawer where I'd once kept personal items. It was empty now. I placed my notebook inside instead. The same one I'd used in the hotel. I wrote down a single sentence. Power is quiet when it's earned. The press never called. No one outside the building knew what had happened. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Revenge when done loudly invites retaliation. When done precisely, it becomes precedent. As March ended, I received an invitation to a wedding I would have attended once without question. A cousin of my husband's. I declined politely. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. I was no longer required to show up where I was tolerated instead of respected. On the last day of the month, I stayed late. The city lights reflected off the glass walls. I thought about the woman who had collapsed on a tiled floor, convinced she was the problem. She hadn't been weak. She had been alone. And now she wasn't. April waited ahead. With it, the final chapter of the separation. The formal severing of a life built on conditional belonging. I turned off the lights and locked the door behind me. Not to keep others out, but to remind myself that I no longer needed permission to close it. April began with paperwork. Not the dramatic kind people imagine when they think of endings. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just signatures, initials, and the quiet acknowledgement that something once believed permanent had reached its limit. The separation became official on a Tuesday morning. I sat across from my husband in a conference room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. We didn't look at each other while we signed. At the end, the mediator asked if there was anything either of us wanted to say. My husband hesitated, then shook his head. I did the same. Words I had learned are often used to delay action. Everything that mattered had already been decided. Outside, the sky was clear. The kind of blue that feels almost aggressive after months of gray. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer than necessary, letting the sun hit my face, grounding myself in the ordinary. Divorce does not always feel like loss. Sometimes it feels like accuracy. At the office, April brought audits. External ones. Independent firms with no loyalty to family names or old narratives. They asked difficult questions, requested explanations that had never been demanded before. I welcomed them. Transparency has a way of disinfecting spaces that have grown used to darkness. Some findings were minor, others were not. Nothing criminal, but enough to explain why instability had followed certain decisions like a shadow. The board accepted the recommendations without argument. My role shifted again. Not back to what it had been before. Something new, more defined, less exposed. I stopped trying to be liked. Instead, I focused on being clear. One afternoon, I found myself alone in the break room, staring at a bulletin board someone had updated with new values. Accountability, respect, integrity. Words are easy. Enforcement is not. I pinned a single note beneath them, a sentence from my notebook. Silence is not consent. No one asked who put it there. Midway through the month, my former mother-in-law sent me a message, not to reconcile, not to accuse. She wanted to return something. A box arrived 2 days later. Inside were early documents from the company's first year, handwritten notes, drafts, my handwriting younger and more optimistic. I hadn't realized she'd kept them. There was no letter, no explanation. I placed the box in my office closet and closed the door. Some things don't need reinterpretation. Social invitations slowed. The kind that had always been attached to my husband's name fell away. Others appeared. Women I'd known peripherally reached out, asked to talk, to walk, to ask questions they'd never asked aloud. I listened. I didn't give advice, I told the truth. That truth didn't always feel hopeful, but it was real. Late one evening, as I reviewed financial projections, I noticed a small but significant improvement. Nothing flashy, just stability returning to places where fear had once dictated decisions. I smiled then, not out of triumph, out of recognition. This was what repair looked like, not revenge. Repair. At home, I slept better. The dreams of doorless rooms faded. I replaced the mattress, changed the light fixtures, made the space my own again without asking what anyone else preferred. I hosted no holidays, attended no family dinners. I chose quiet. By the end of April, the company posted its first fully independent quarterly report. Clean, unembellished, honest. I signed off on it without hesitation. That night, I poured a glass of wine and sat on the balcony. The city hummed below. Somewhere families gathered. Arguments simmered. Old patterns repeated. I felt no urge to intervene. The desire to be understood had finally loosened its grip. What I wanted now was simpler. To live in alignment. To choose myself without apology. April ended not with celebration but with a sense of alignment I had never known before. And for the first time since the rain-soaked night I signed my name away, I understood that revenge had never been the point. Reclamation was, and it was ongoing. May arrived quietly, and with it a kind of stillness I hadn't anticipated. Not peace, not yet, but space. The company no longer consumed every waking thought. Systems were in place. Leadership was distributed. I could step back without disappearing. That distinction mattered. I began leaving the office earlier. Walking instead of driving when the weather allowed. Noticing storefronts I'd passed for years without seeing. Life had resumed its scale. One afternoon I ran into someone I hadn't seen since before everything fell apart. A woman I'd mentored briefly in the early days of the company. She looked surprised, then pleased. "You look different," she said. "I feel accurate," I replied. She laughed, unsure if I was joking. I wasn't. She told me she'd started her own firm. Smaller, leaner, on her terms. She thanked me for something I barely remembered saying years earlier. It struck me then how influence works. Quiet, delayed, often unnoticed by the person who sets it in motion. At home, I sorted through belongings I'd postponed confronting. Objects carry memory, whether we acknowledge it or not. I kept what felt honest, let go of what felt performative. There was a box of holiday decorations I'd never chosen. I donated it without ceremony. Mid-May, the final divorce papers were filed. No courtroom drama, no last-minute pleas, just signatures processed by people who had no idea what they represented. When it was done, my attorney shook my hand. "You handled this with restraint," she said. "I handled it with necessity," I replied. The difference matters. My ex-husband sent a message that evening, a single sentence. "I hope you find what you're looking for." I read it once, then archived it. I had already found it. The board scheduled a retreat toward the end of the month. Strategic planning, long-term vision. I attended, but I didn't lead every session. I watched others step forward, listened to ideas that weren't mine. That too felt like reclamation. Control isn't about holding everything, it's about knowing when to let go. One evening during the retreat, we talked about legacy, not in the grand sense, in the practical one. What systems would outlast us? What decisions would remain after we were gone? I thought about inheritance, not of money, of patterns. I had inherited silence. I chose to interrupt it. Back in the city, I received an invitation to speak at a small conference. Women founders, mid-career, burned out, curious. I accepted. I didn't tell my story in detail. I didn't need to. I spoke about boundaries, about the difference between support and substitution, about how easily competence becomes invisible when it's wrapped in accommodation. Afterward, a woman in her 50s approached me. She held my hands and said, "I wish I'd heard this 20 years ago." I didn't offer comfort. I offered recognition. That night alone, I reflected on the word revenge again. How it had framed this entire chapter of my life even when it no longer fit. What I had done wasn't retaliation. It was refusal. Refusal to be erased quietly. Refusal to accept harm packaged as concern. Refusal to mistake endurance for virtue. May ended with a simple ritual. I returned to the hotel where I'd stayed in those first weeks, sat in the lobby for a while, remembered the woman who had hidden there gathering herself in pieces. I left without checking in. Some places are meant to be transitional. As summer approached, I felt something unfamiliar settle in. Not vigilance, confidence. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that waits. And I knew with certainty that the final reckoning was not behind me. It was within. And it was complete. June brought heat and with it a reckoning I hadn't planned for but understood immediately. The company received a formal inquiry from a regulatory body, routine on paper, a review triggered by the restructuring and the rapid change in leadership. Nothing accusatory, just questions. The board panicked. I did not. I had spent months preparing for this possibility. Clean records, clear timelines, independent audits already completed. Transparency had been my insurance policy. Still, the inquiry reopened wounds my former in-laws had hoped would remain sealed. They requested a meeting, not through attorneys, through family. My former mother-in-law called my phone directly for the first time since April. "We need to talk," she said. "No softness, no pretense." I agreed to meet her and my former father-in-law in a neutral office provided by my attorney. My ex-husband was not present. They arrived together united again by necessity rather than affection. Age had crept up on them in ways I hadn't noticed before. Control once loosened rarely returns gracefully. This investigation could damage everything my former father-in-law said. Our reputation, the company. "The company will be fine," I replied. "It's compliant." "You know what we mean," he snapped. "Yes," I said, "I do." They asked me to intervene, to smooth things over, to provide assurances, to speak on their behalf. I declined. "I've already done my part," I said, accurately. My former mother-in-law leaned forward. "After everything we did for you," I held her gaze. "You didn't do things for me. You did them through me." The silence that followed was brittle. "This isn't revenge," my former father-in-law said. "This is unnecessary." I nodded. "That's what you said when I asked to be informed." They left without resolution. The inquiry moved forward. Methodical, impersonal, the way justice often does when stripped of drama. Nothing catastrophic followed. No fines, no public statements. But the review concluded with recommendations that permanently altered governance. Limits on familial control. Mandatory disclosures. Oversight they could no longer bypass. They had lost what they valued most. Not the company. The ability to operate unchecked. I received no apology. I didn't expect one. Mid-June. I attended the conference I'd agreed to speak at. The audience was smaller than expected. The room was warm. The questions were direct. Someone asked me if revenge had been worth it. I paused before answering. "I didn't seek revenge," I said. "I sought alignment." Revenge is loud. Alignment is quiet. One consumes you. The other frees you. The room was silent. Then someone nodded. After the session, messages came in. Emails, notes, women thanking me for saying things they hadn't known how to articulate. I read them slowly. This, I realized, was the unexpected consequence of telling the truth without embellishment. It creates space. At home, I rearranged the living room. Removed a large table we'd never used. Replaced it with 2 chairs and a lamp. The room felt smaller, warmer, human. I hosted a dinner for friends who had watched from a distance, unsure when to step in. We ate simply, laughed easily. No one asked about the company. That felt like progress. Toward the end of the month, I received confirmation that the regulatory review had closed. I forwarded it to the board with a single line. Resolved. No exclamation point. No victory lap. June ended with a heat wave. The city slowed. People retreated indoors. I took long walks at dusk when the air softened and the streets emptied. I thought about the many ways this could have gone differently. The version of me that might have stayed silent, that might have accepted erasure as the cost of belonging. She would have survived, but she would not have lived. The revenge story people imagine ends with punishment. Mine ended with boundaries, and those I discovered are far more disruptive. July waited ahead, and with it the final chapter of understanding what freedom actually costs. July changed the temperature of everything, not just the weather, the way people spoke to me, the way I spoke to myself. The company moved into a quieter phase, not expansion, consolidation, repair, the kind of work that doesn't attract praise but determines longevity. I delegated more, trusted systems instead of instincts sharpened by crisis. For the first time in years, I took a full week off. No laptop, no emergency contact. I drove north without a planned stop when I felt like it stayed where the rooms were clean and unremarkable. I ate alone without scrolling. I slept without alarms. On the 3rd night, sitting on a motel balcony with a view of nothing in particular, it hit me how tightly wound I had been for so long, not just during the collapse, long before it. I had confused endurance with strength, I had believed that being chosen meant being compliant. I had thought love was something you earned by shrinking. Those beliefs hadn't come from my ex-husband alone, or his parents. They had simply recognized them and used them efficiently. That realization didn't come with bitterness. It came with responsibility. When I returned, I found a letter waiting at home, handwritten. My former mother-in-law's handwriting was unmistakable. She didn't apologize. She explained how she had feared losing relevance as she aged, how the company had given her purpose, how my willingness to step back had felt like permission. She wrote that she didn't expect forgiveness, only acknowledgement. I read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it in a drawer. Understanding does not require reconciliation. Mid-July, the board finalized a long-term governance plan. My role was secure, defined, protected, not dominant, balanced. That balance mattered. I turned down a proposed acquisition that would have tripled valuation but concentrated power too quickly. The old version of me would have said yes out of fear of missing momentum. This version asked a different question. At what cost? One afternoon, my ex-husband requested a brief meeting, no agenda, no intermediaries. I agreed reluctantly to meet in a public park. He looked thinner, less certain. He spoke first. I didn't think you'd actually leave, he said. I know, I replied. I thought things would settle. They did, I said. Just not in your favor. He nodded. I see that now. There was a long pause. I'm sorry, he said finally. I believed he meant it. In the limited way people mean things when they've already lost leverage. I accept that you're sorry, I said. That doesn't change what I need. He asked what that was. Distance, I replied. He didn't argue. That was the last time we met. July ended with Independence Day fireworks echoing across the city. I watched them from my balcony, not thinking about symbolism, just enjoying the noise and light without attaching meaning. Freedom, I realized, doesn't arrive in a single moment. It accumulates, in the choices you stop explaining, in the silence you no longer fill, in the boundaries you enforce without anger. As summer deepened, I felt something settle into place. Not closure, integration. The story no longer ran in my head on a loop. It had become part of me, not the whole of me. One chapter remained. Not for revenge, for clarity, and for the woman who would never again confuse control for care. December returned quietly. Not the same December. Not the kind that smells like expectation and obligation. This one arrived without asking anything of me. I noticed it first in the light. The way it fell earlier each afternoon, softer, less demanding. The city slowed. People turned inward. I did too, but without fear. A year had passed since the night I refused to sign. That anniversary mattered more than any holiday. The company closed the year steady. Not spectacular. Profitable enough. Clean enough. Honest in a way it hadn't been before. The board sent a brief end-of-year summary. I read it, approved it, and closed the file. Work had returned to its proper size, so had everything else. On Christmas Eve, I stayed home. No tree, no forced cheer, just a simple dinner and the quiet hum of the heater cycling on and off. I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window watching lights flicker on in other apartments. Some where families were gathering, some were pretending, some were healing, some were breaking in ways that would take years to name. I felt no urge to compare. I thought about the woman I had been 12 months earlier. Hospital bracelet still warm on her wrist, body shut down from carrying too much without protest, mind convinced that endurance was the same as love. She had believed that if she stayed calm enough, quiet enough, useful enough, she would be protected. She had been wrong. Protection does not come from compliance. It comes from clarity. Around 9, my phone buzzed. A message from a junior manager I had promoted in the spring. Thank you for changing how things work here. It matters. I typed back a single sentence. Make sure it stays that way. I didn't receive messages from my former in-laws or my ex-husband. I hadn't expected to. Some connections end not with conflict but with irrelevance. That I had learned is its own form of peace. Later that night, I opened the notebook one last time. The pages were full. Dates, observations, sentences written in hotel rooms and court waiting areas and offices that had once felt hostile. I flipped through them slowly. There was no satisfaction in rereading the pain, only recognition of distance. I wrote one final entry. I chose myself before they ever did. Then I closed it and placed it on the shelf. The story no longer needed documentation. Just before midnight, I stepped onto the balcony. The air was cold and clean. Somewhere church bells rang. Somewhere else, laughter spilled into the street. I didn't make a wish. I didn't need to. What I had learned over the past year was simple and brutal and freeing. Love that requires your silence is not love. Family that thrives on your erasure is not family. Peace that comes at the cost of your autonomy is not peace. Revenge had never been my goal, despite what people would call it. What I had done was far more dangerous than retaliation. I had withdrawn consent. I had reclaimed authorship. I had chosen dignity over belonging. That choice had cost me a marriage, a role, an identity I thought was fixed. It had given me something better: agency. As the clock crossed into Christmas Day, I turned off the lights and went inside. Tomorrow would be quiet and ordinary and entirely mine. If you've listened this far, if any part of this felt familiar, I'll leave you with this. Pay attention to the places where you're told to be patient instead of informed, grateful instead of equal, quiet instead of clear. Those are not small compromises. They are warnings. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived a version of it, or are standing at the edge of your own decision, I'd like to hear from you. Share your thoughts. Share your line in the sand. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about reclaiming power without losing yourself, you know what to do. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can say is nothing at all. And then act anyway.